Footsteps crunched against the gravel of $1 million driveway, shattering the quiet suburban evening. What started as a routine patrol morphed into a brutal display of abuse when a veteran officer slapped a defenseless woman on her own property. He thought he was untouchable. He thought she was just another target. But the universe has a wicked sense of irony. When her true identity was finally revealed, his arrogance didn't just fade. His knees literally buckled under the crushing weight of pure, undeniable karma. Crestview Hills was the kind of neighborhood where silence was a purchased commodity. Located just outside the bustling metropolitan heart of the city, it was a sanctuary of sprawling estates, meticulously manicured lawns, and towering oak trees that stood like ancient sentinels guarding the elite. It was a place where crime was an abstract concept, relegated to the evening news and entirely detached from the daily lives of its residents. Dr. Josephine Henderson loved the quiet. At 46, she had spent the last 2 decades fighting in the loudest, most chaotic arenas of the American justice system. As a former federal prosecutor who had recently been appointed as the Deputy Attorney General for the United States Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, her life was a relentless storm of high-stakes litigation, press conferences, and political warfare. Tonight, however, she was just Josephine. It was a crisp Friday evening in late October. Josephine had just returned from a grueling week in Washington, D.C. She had stripped off her armor, a bespoke charcoal blazer and pearls, and traded it for a faded Yale law hoodie, loose gray sweatpants, and a pair of worn-out slippers. She poured herself a glass of sparkling water, ready to finally decompress, when her phone buzzed with a delivery notification. A highly sensitive bundle of legal briefs had been dropped off, but according to the photo, the courier had mistakenly left the heavy box at the very end of her long, winding driveway, right near the stone pillars that marked the entrance to her property. Sighing, Josephine tightened the drawstrings of her hoodie and stepped out into the chilly night air. The wind rustled through the dying autumn leaves as she made her way down the sweeping expanse of stamped concrete. Just 2 blocks away, Officer Bradley Higgins was cruising through the neighborhood in his patrol car. Higgins was a 22-year veteran of the local police department, a man whose career had stagnated a decade ago. He was bitter, passed over for a promotion to sergeant 4 separate times. In his mind, the world had passed him by, handing his rightful achievements to younger, less experienced officers to satisfy what he aggressively deemed woke quotas. He was a man fueled by resentment, carrying a heavy chip on his shoulder that he often took out on the citizens he was sworn to protect. Riding shotgun was Officer Connor Reed, a 23-year-old rookie barely 6 months out of the academy. Connor was nervous, hyper-aware of Higgins's notoriously short temper, and desperately trying to survive his probationary period without getting onto the older cop's bad side. As the cruiser rounded the corner onto Elmwood Drive, the sweeping headlights caught a figure standing at the end of a long driveway, bending over to pick up a large cardboard box. Higgins narrowed his eyes. The headlights illuminated a black woman dressed in baggy sweats and a hoodie, lifting a package in one of the most affluent, predominantly white neighborhoods in the state. "Look at this," Higgins muttered, his voice dripping with immediate, unfiltered suspicion. "Porch pirate. Bold as hell, too." "Brad, wait," Connor said, squinting through the windshield. "She's not on a porch. She's at the end of the driveway. Maybe she lives there? In that house?" Higgins let out a sharp, condescending bark of a laugh. The house behind Josephine was a sprawling, modern craftsman mansion worth upwards of $4 million. "Yeah, right. She's probably a maid or a cleaner who decided to take a little bonus home with her. I'm putting a stop to this." Before Connor could suggest calling it in or simply observing, Higgins flipped on the red and blue flashing lights and hit the siren with a quick, aggressive whoop-whoop. Josephine startled, dropping the heavy box back onto the pavement. She turned, shielding her eye as the cruiser's blinding spotlight was flicked on and aimed directly at her face. The cruiser lurched to a halt right at the curb, the tires screeching slightly. Higgins threw his door open and stepped out, his hand instinctively resting on the butt of his service weapon. "Step away from the box and keep your hands where I can see them," he barked, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet neighborhood. Josephine blinked against the harsh glare, her initial shock rapidly transforming into irritation. "Excuse me, officer. Is there a problem?" "I said step away from the box!" Higgins advanced, his chest puffed out, dominating the space. He didn't see a federal official. He saw someone who didn't belong, someone he could exert his authority over to make himself feel powerful. Josephine took one step back, maintaining her composure. She had dealt with aggressive, arrogant men her entire professional life. "There's no need to yell, officer. This is my property. I am simply retrieving a package that was misdelivered to the end of my driveway." "Your property?" Higgins sneered, closing the distance until he was mere feet from her. He looked her up and down, taking in the faded hoodie and the messy bun on top of her head. "You expect me to believe you own this estate?" "I don't expect anything from you other than professionalism," Josephine replied, her voice dropping an octave, taking on the icy, authoritative tone that had made corrupt politicians sweat in the witness box. "My name is Dr. Josephine Henderson. I am the homeowner. Now please turn off that spotlight. It's entirely unnecessary." Higgins felt a flash of hot anger. He hated when citizens spoke back to him, but he despised it even more when they did it with a tone of authority. "I don't care what you claim your name is. Let's see some ID." "I stepped out of my front door to grab a box," Josephine said calmly. "My identification is inside the house. If you would like to accompany me to the front door, I will gladly show it to you. However, legally, I am under no obligation to present identification to you while standing on my own private property without reasonable, articulable suspicion that I have committed a crime." The legal jargon hit Higgins like a physical blow to his ego. The rookie Connor had stepped out of the passenger side and was standing near the trunk, looking visibly uncomfortable. "Brad," Connor mumbled. "She says she lives here. Maybe we should just let her—" "Shut up, Reed," Higgins snapped, never taking his eyes off Josephine. He turned his attention back to her, his face flushing red. "You think because you know a couple of big words you can play lawyer with me? You are holding a package. I have reasonable suspicion you're stealing it." "The package has my name on it," Josephine countered firmly, pointing down at the shipping label. "Read it." Higgins felt his authority crumbling, and in his world, authority was the only currency that mattered. He didn't look down at the box. Instead, he lunged forward and grabbed Josephine's left arm with a brutal, vice-like grip. "I'm detaining you pending an investigation," Higgins growled. Josephine's eyes flared with a sudden, dangerous intensity. She did not physically resist, but her voice was a sharp blade in the night. "Remove your hand from my person." "Right. Now." The sheer command in her voice short-circuited Higgins's brain. In a moment of blind, bruised ego and unchecked aggression, he let go of her arm, pulled his hand back, and delivered a sharp, stinging slap directly across her left cheek. The sound of the flesh-on-flesh impact echoed like a gunshot in the silent, wealthy enclave. Time seemed to grind to an absolute halt. The stinging crack of the slap hung in the cold October air, a violent punctuation mark that fundamentally altered the trajectory of both of their lives. Josephine's head snapped to the side from the sheer force of the blow. A sickening metallic taste immediately flooded her mouth as her teeth clipped the inside of her cheek. The physical pain was sharp, but the psychological shock was a tidal wave. She stood perfectly still, her face turned away. processing the impossible reality of what had just occurred. In her 20-plus years in the legal system, she had read thousands of police brutality reports. She had prosecuted bad cops. She had stood over crime scenes, but experiencing it, feeling the stinging, humiliating violation of a uniformed officer striking her in the face on the very concrete she owned, was a profound, chilling violation. Behind the cruiser, Officer Connor Reed let out a choked gasp. "Jesus Christ, Brad! What are you doing?" The rookie took 2 frantic steps forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture, his eyes wide with absolute horror. Higgins was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his Kevlar vest. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of realization crossed his eyes, the knowledge that he had crossed an inexcusable line. But rather than de-escalate, his toxic pride doubled down. Adrenaline and stubborn arrogance washed away any semblance of reason. He couldn't back down now. Backing down meant admitting he was wrong. "She was resisting," Higgins barked at his partner, the lie leaving his lips with practiced ease. He turned back to Josephine, pulling his handcuffs from his belt with a sharp, metallic jingle. "Turn around! Hands behind your back!" Josephine slowly turned her head back to face him. She didn't raise a hand to her burning cheek. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. Instead, she looked at Bradley Higgins with a gaze so terrifyingly cold, so entirely devoid of fear, that it made the veteran cop involuntarily swallow hard. Her dark eyes locked onto his, memorizing the shape of his jaw, the redness in his face, the brass nameplate pinned to his chest. "B. Higgins, you have just made the single biggest mistake of your entire life," Josephine said. Her voice was not a yell. It was a deadly, quiet promise. "Turn around," Higgins roared, his voice cracking slightly under the weight of her stare. He grabbed her by the shoulders, roughly spinning her around. He slammed her chest against the cold, unyielding metal of the police cruiser's trunk. The impact knocked the wind out of her, but she remained silent. He wrenched her arms backward, twisting her wrists at an agonizing angle. The steel cuffs ratcheted tightly around her wrists, the metal biting deeply into her skin. He made sure to squeeze them one click tighter than necessary, a petty, painful exertion of his dominance. "Brad, this is messed up," Connor pleaded, his voice trembling as he stepped closer. "She wasn't doing anything. She just—" "I said back off, Reed," Higgins snarled, spit flying from his lips. "You want to pass your probation? You keep your mouth shut and watch how real police work is done." She got aggressive. She caught a charge: assault on an officer, resisting arrest, and suspected grand larceny. Josephine, pressed against the cold trunk, let out a soft, almost imperceptible scoff. It wasn't a sound of defeat. It was the sound of a predator calculating the exact moment to strike. Higgins grabbed her by the bicep, yanking her away from the trunk. "In the car. Now." He shoved her toward the back door of the cruiser, pushing her head down roughly as he forced her into the hard plastic back seat. He slammed the door shut with a definitive thud. Inside the dark, caged rear of the cruiser, Josephine shifted, ignoring the searing pain in her wrists and the throbbing in her cheek. She sat up straight, taking deep, measured breaths. Her mind was already operating at 100 miles an hour, shifting from the victim of an assault into the apex legal predator she was trained to be. She was mentally drafting the federal indictments. She was cataloging the civil rights violations. She was memorizing the timestamps. Higgins stormed around to the driver's side and got in, slamming the door. Connor slipped into the passenger seat, looking pale and nauseous. He didn't dare look back through the plexiglass divider at the woman in the back. Higgins slammed the car into drive and sped away from the mansion, leaving the cardboard box full of Department of Justice documents, sitting alone on the edge of the driveway. As they drove toward the city, the silence in the car was suffocating. Higgins tried to fill it with bluster, needing to justify his actions to his partner and to himself. "You see that, Reed?" Higgins said, tapping the steering wheel aggressively. "That's exactly the problem with these people. They get a little bit of money, or they work for someone with money, and they think the law doesn't apply to them. They think they can talk back. You got to show them early on who runs the streets." Connor swallowed hard, staring blankly out the window at the passing streetlights. "She didn't look like she was stealing, Brad, and you didn't have to hit her. She made a sudden movement." Higgins lied loudly, specifically raising his voice so the dashcam microphone would pick it up. "She was non-compliant. I used necessary force to gain compliance. End of story." From the back seat, Josephine finally spoke. Her voice cut through the plexiglass divider. Perfectly calm, perfectly modulated. "Officer Higgins," she said. Higgins glanced in the rearview mirror. Even in the dim light, he could see the angry red welt swelling on her cheek. "You keep your mouth shut back there, or I'll add a disturbing the peace charge to your jacket. I am formally requesting your badge number, as well as the badge number of your partner," Josephine stated, ignoring his threat entirely. Higgins let out a cruel, mocking laugh. "Oh, you want my badge number? Gonna file a complaint? Go right ahead, sweetheart. It's badge number 44409. And the rookie here is 882. Tell the captain I said hi." "Thank you," Josephine said simply. "And just so we are perfectly clear for the dash cam audio recording, you struck me on the left side of my face after I refused to produce identification on my private property, and you have cuffed me without reading me my Miranda rights after taking me into custody." Higgins's grip on the steering wheel tightened until his knuckles turned white. He didn't like how analytical she sounded. She wasn't acting like a scared civilian. She was acting like a lawyer building a case. "You don't need Miranda until I interrogate you, genius," Higgins spat back, though a tiny, nagging seed of doubt began to take root in his stomach. "Save it for the public defender," Josephine smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile in the shadows of the back seat. She didn't say another word for the rest of the ride. She didn't need to. The trap was already set, and Officer Bradley Higgins was driving himself straight into it. The 12th precinct was a crumbling, brutalist concrete structure in the heart of the city's downtown district. It was notoriously underfunded, perpetually smelling of stale coffee, industrial floor wax, and the metallic tang of adrenaline. At 10:45 p.m. on a Friday, the precinct was a hive of chaotic activity. Phones were ringing off the hook, officers were dragging in belligerent drunks, and uniform radios squawked with a relentless stream of dispatch codes. Higgins whipped the cruiser into the secure parking garage beneath the precinct, throwing the car into park with a violent jerk. He was eager to get this booking over with, to write his report cementing his fabricated version of events, and to prove to his rookie partner that his authority was absolute. Connor practically bolted from the passenger side, looking like a man walking to his own execution. He stood by as Higgins opened the rear door and grabbed Josephine by the arm, yanking her out of the vehicle. "Let's go, sweetheart." "Walk," Higgins commanded, giving her a completely unnecessary shove toward the heavy steel doors leading to the booking area. Josephine adjusted her balance, holding her head high. Despite the faded hoodie, the messy hair, the handcuffs biting into her wrists, and the prominent, purple-red bruise blooming across her left cheekbone, she carried herself with the undeniable posture of someone who owned the room. Higgins marched her through the steel doors and down the long, fluorescent-lit hallway toward the main bullpen. As they entered the crowded booking area, the noise was deafening. Cops were shouting over each other, typing loudly on ancient keyboards and wrangling uncooperative suspects. Sitting behind the elevated booking desk was Desk Sergeant Paul Evans. Paul was a 30-year veteran of the force, a man who had seen everything and survived by paying meticulous attention to detail. That morning, Paul had attended a mandatory, high-clearance briefing with the precinct captain and the chief of police. The briefing was regarding a highly sensitive, impending federal audit of the department's use-of-force policies. They had been given a dossier. They had been shown a photograph of the newly appointed DOJ Deputy Attorney General, who would be leading the audit. Higgins dragged Josephine right up to the elevated desk, slapping his hand loudly on the worn wooden surface to get Paul's attention. "Got a live one for you, Paul," Higgins announced loudly, a smug smirk plastered across his face. He wanted the other officers in the bullpen to hear him. Caught her red-handed stealing packages up in Crestview Hills. Got mouthy, resisted arrest. Had to use physical compliance to subdue her. Throw her in holding cell 3 while I write up the felonies. Sergeant Paul Evans slowly lifted his head from his paperwork, adjusting his reading glasses. He looked at Higgins. Then his eyes shifted to the woman standing beside him in handcuffs. Paul's gaze landed on the bruised cheek. Then he looked at her eyes. The air in Paul Evans's lungs seemed to vanish instantly. His face, normally a ruddy, healthy pink, drained to a sickly, chalky white in a matter of seconds. His hands began to tremble so violently that he dropped his pen. It clattered loudly onto the floor. "Brad," Paul whispered, his voice cracking. He stood up slowly, completely ignoring Higgins, his eyes locked in sheer, unadulterated terror on the woman in the faded Yale hoodie. "Yeah, I know. She doesn't look like much," Higgins laughed, entirely oblivious to the atmosphere shifting in the room. "But she fought like a stray cat." "Shut up!" Paul hissed, his voice suddenly sharp, cutting through the ambient noise of the bullpen. The sheer panic in the desk sergeant's voice was so unusual that the officers at the nearby desks stopped typing. The drunken suspects momentarily quieted down. A strange, suffocating silence began to ripple outward from the booking desk. "Excuse me?" Higgins bristled, his ego flaring again. "I bring in a felony collar and you tell me to shut up?" Before Paul could answer, the door to the captain's office, located at the far end of the bullpen, swung open. Captain Richard Gallagher stepped out, a steaming mug of coffee in his hand. Gallagher was a hard-nosed, politically ambitious man who was desperately trying to keep his precinct from being dismantled by the impending federal investigation. Gallagher glanced over the railing of the mezzanine, his eyes sweeping over the bullpen as they usually did to maintain order. His gaze washed over Higgins, then moved to the handcuffed woman next to him. Gallagher froze. He didn't just stop walking. His entire body went rigid as if he had been struck by lightning. The ceramic coffee mug slipped from his fingers, plummeting to the linoleum floor below and shattering into 100 pieces. The loud crash echoed like an explosion in the suddenly quiet room. Higgins looked up toward the balcony, a grin spreading across his face. He assumed the captain had witnessed him bringing in a tough collar. "Evening, Captain. Got a suspect resisting." "Get your hands off of her," Gallagher commanded. His voice wasn't a yell. It was a breathless, horrified gasp that carried through the silent room. Higgins blinked, confused. "Captain, she was—" "I said get your hands off her!" Gallagher roared, the sound tearing from his throat with such ferocious panic that 2 nearby officers actually drew their weapons out of sheer reflex. Gallagher scrambled down the metal stairs, his heavy boots echoing rapidly. He sprinted across the bullpen, shoving officers out of his way until he skidded to a halt in front of the booking desk. He looked at the handcuffs cutting into Josephine's wrists. He looked at the swelling, ugly welt on her cheek. Gallagher's breathing was shallow and ragged. Sweat instantly beaded on his forehead. He looked at Higgins with a mixture of absolute hatred and profound disbelief. "Give me the keys," Gallagher demanded, his voice shaking. "Captain, what the hell is going on?" Higgins asked, the first true spike of anxiety piercing through his arrogant shell. "She's a porch pirate. I caught her in Crestview. Give me the keys right now, or so help me God, I will draw my weapon and shoot you where you stand," Gallagher whispered, his eyes wide, completely unhinged by the catastrophic reality of the situation. Higgins, stunned and suddenly terrified by his captain's reaction, fumbled at his belt and handed over the small silver handcuff key. Gallagher's hands shook as he quickly unlocked the cuffs. The heavy steel fell away, leaving deep, red indentations on Josephine's wrists. Gallagher took a step back, as if afraid to be too close to her, and stood at attention, his posture rigidly military. Higgins watched, utterly bewildered. The entire precinct was dead silent. Every single pair of eyes was glued to the scene. Gallagher swallowed hard, his voice trembling as he addressed the woman in the sweatpants. "Madam Deputy Attorney General," Gallagher said, bowing his head slightly in profound deference. I cannot begin to express the depth of my apologies." The words floated in the air. "Madam Deputy Attorney General." The silence in the room deepened, transforming from mere quiet into a heavy, suffocating vacuum. Higgins stood completely frozen. His brain struggled to process the syllables. He looked at the woman he had slapped. He looked at the faded Yale hoodie. He thought of the mansion in Crestview Hills. He thought of her demanding his badge number. "You have just made the single biggest mistake of your entire life." Her words echoed in his mind, ringing with horrifying clarity. Josephine brought her hands to the front, slowly rubbing her sore wrists. She didn't look at Captain Gallagher. She turned her head, fixing her cold, unyielding stare directly onto Bradley Higgins. Higgins felt a sharp, stabbing pain in the center of his chest. The air was suddenly sucked from his lungs. The peripheral vision in his eyes began to tunnel, darkening at the edges. His arrogant sneer dissolved, replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated horror. He tried to speak, tried to force air through his suddenly dry throat, but all that came out was a pathetic, wheezing gasp as he realized that he hadn't just ended his career. He had destroyed his entire life. And as Josephine Henderson took a single, deliberate step toward him, Officer Bradley Higgins felt his legs turn to absolute jelly, and his knees violently hit the floor. The thud of Bradley Higgins's kneecaps hitting the scuffed linoleum floor echoed through the dead silence of the 12th precinct. He didn't kneel out of respect. His nervous system had simply short-circuited. The arrogance that had inflated his chest for 22 years evaporated in a microsecond, leaving behind a hollow, hyperventilating shell of a man. His mouth opened and closed like a suffocating fish, but no sound came out. Captain Richard Gallagher stood frozen, his face a mask of sweating terror. Desk Sergeant Paul Evans hadn't moved a muscle, his hand still hovering over the spot where he had dropped his pen. Every officer in the bullpen was paralyzed, watching the most powerful federal prosecutor in the country stand barefoot in their booking area, bearing the unmistakable, swelling mark of a police officer's physical assault. Josephine Henderson didn't shout. She didn't gloat. She simply adjusted the sleeves of her faded Yale law hoodie, her dark eyes locking on to the trembling captain. "Captain Gallagher," Josephine said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm, conversational volume. It was the tone of a woman who held the power to vaporize the entire building with a single phone call. Yes, ma'am. Madam Deputy Attorney General," Gallagher stammered, frantically wiping a bead of sweat from his brow. "I require 3 things immediately," Josephine stated, holding up 3 fingers. "First, I want my personal cell phone. Second, I want a paramedic dispatched to this precinct to photograph and document the blunt force trauma to my face and the lacerations on my wrists. Third, I want the immediate confiscation of Officer Higgins's service weapon, his badge, his personal cell phone, and the hard drive containing the dashcam and bodycam footage of my illegal arrest. Right away, ma'am. Immediately. Gallagher practically choked on the words. He spun around, pointing a shaking finger at a nearby lieutenant. Get the medic, now, and secure cruiser 42. Josephine slowly turned her gaze down to the pathetic heap of a man kneeling on the floor. Higgins was staring up at her, his eyes wide and bloodshot, tears of sheer panic welling in the corners. He raised a trembling hand, as if to beg for mercy. Dr. Henderson, I didn't know, Higgins whimpered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic whine. I swear to God, I thought you were— You thought I was someone who couldn't fight back, Josephine interrupted, the icy precision of her words slicing through his desperate plea. You thought I was a civilian without resources. You thought my constitutional rights were a suggestion. You didn't make a mistake, Bradley. You operated exactly as you have been trained to operate by your own unchecked ego. The only difference tonight is the prey you chose to hunt. She stepped closer to him, looking down with absolute disdain. You are in violation of Title 18, United States Code, Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law, because you used a dangerous weapon, your vehicle as a tool of false imprisonment, and because physical injury resulted from your battery. You are looking at a federal felony carrying a maximum sentence of 10 years in a federal penitentiary. And I promise you, I will make sure you serve every single day of it. Higgins let out a choked, guttural sob, his head dropping toward his chest as he realized the absolute finality of her words. This wasn't a departmental write-up. This wasn't a 2-week paid suspension. This was federal prison. From the back of the room, Officer Connor Reed had been standing completely still, his face pale green. Josephine's eyes flicked over to the rookie. Connor immediately stiffened, bracing for his own destruction. Officer Reed, Josephine said softly. Yes, Mom, Connor croaked. You attempted to de-escalate, she noted, her memory of the driveway crystalline. You questioned his lack of reasonable suspicion. But you still put me in that car. When the FBI arrives, you will give a fully sworn, truthful statement detailing every single word Officer Higgins said tonight. If you omit a single syllable, you will share his cell block. Do you understand me? Yes, ma'am. Every word. Connor nodded frantically, desperate to sever himself from his partner's sinking ship. Within 10 minutes, the local paramedics were carefully photographing Josephine's face. Within 20 minutes, the heavy steel doors of the precinct swung open, and the atmosphere shifted from panic to absolute lockdown. 4 men in dark suits, wearing FBI windbreakers, strode into the bullpen. The special agent in charge of the local field office, a tall, no-nonsense man named Thomas Croft, bypassed the captain entirely and walked straight to Josephine. Dr. Henderson, SAC Croft said, his eyes narrowing as he took in the bruise on her cheek. Are you all right? I am fine, Thomas. Thank you for coming so quickly, Josephine said, finally allowing a small, weary sigh to escape her lips. I trust you have a secure transport ready? Right outside, Croft replied. He turned to look at Gallagher, who was practically shrinking against the wall. Captain, the Department of Justice is taking immediate jurisdiction of this precinct. Nobody leaves. Nobody makes a phone call. Secure the perimeter. Croft then gestured to 2 of his agents. He pointed directly at Bradley Higgins, who was still slumped on a nearby bench, his head buried in his hands. Cuff him, Croft ordered. Federal standards. The interrogation room was a sterile, windowless box painted in institutional grey. Bradley Higgins had sat in this room hundreds of times, pounding his fists on the metal table, screaming at frightened teenagers, coercing confessions, and playing the alpha predator. Tonight, he was on the other side of the table. His badge had been stripped from his uniform, leaving a pathetic pinhole on his chest. His gun belt was gone. He sat shivering in the frigid air conditioning, his hands cuffed to the metal ring bolted to the center of the table. Every time the heavy steel door clicked, he jumped, his nerves completely fried by the sheer magnitude of his ruin. At 2:15 a.m., the door clicked open. Higgins looked up, desperate for a friendly face. Instead, his union-appointed attorney, David Horowitz, walked in. Horowitz was a legendary bulldog of a defense lawyer, a man who had gotten dozens of dirty cops out of horrific situations. But tonight, Horowitz looked sick to his stomach. He didn't even bother to open his briefcase. He just pulled out a chair and sat down, staring at Higgins with a mixture of disgust and pity. "David, thank God!" Higgins gasped, straining against the cuffs. "You gotta talk to Gallagher. You gotta talk to the chief. This is a misunderstanding. She was wearing sweatpants. She refused to ID herself." "Shut your mouth, Brad," Horowitz snapped, his voice sharp and utterly devoid of sympathy. "Just shut your mouth before you make this worse." Higgins blinked, stunned by the hostility. "What?" "David, I'm a 20-year veteran. You're my rep. You're supposed to—" "I am supposed to defend cops who make mistakes in the line of duty," Horowitz interrupted, leaning over the table. "I just spent the last 45 minutes in a private room with SAC Croft and an assistant U.S. attorney. They let me watch the dashcam footage, Brad. I heard the audio. I heard her legally, calmly explain her rights on her own property. And I watched you backhand the Deputy Attorney General of the United States because your fragile ego couldn't handle a black woman telling you no." Higgins's face drained of the last remaining color. "It wasn't like that. It is exactly like that." Horowitz slammed his hand on the metal table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "She had a box with Department of Justice seals on it, Brad. Do you even know what was in that box? It was the final draft of a federal consent decree intended to overhaul this entire police department. She was reviewing it over the weekend. You literally assaulted the woman sent here by the president to clean up police corruption." The irony hit Higgins like a physical blow to the stomach. He leaned over, dry heaving into the empty trash can beside the table. "You're done, Brad," Horowitz said quietly, his anger morphing into grim reality. "I'm going to advise you to plead guilty because there is no defense. The chief of police just held a press conference at 3 in the morning. He didn't just suspend you. You have been terminated, effective immediately. You are a civilian. My pension," Higgins whispered, tears spilling onto his lap. 22 years. My pension. Gone, Horowitz confirmed ruthlessly. Fired with extreme cause and facing federal felony charges. The city is officially throwing you to the wolves to save themselves from a larger DOJ probe. And it gets worse. Dr. Henderson isn't just letting the criminal system handle you. She is filing a civil suit. Higgins looked up, his eyes wild with terror. A civil suit? For what? She makes hundreds of thousands of dollars. She's not suing for the money, Horowitz explained, shaking his head. She's suing to make an example of you. She is pursuing a Section 1983 civil rights lawsuit against you personally. Because you acted outside the scope of reasonable duty, the city is revoking your qualified immunity. They will not indemnify you. That means you are personally liable for whatever the jury awards her. Higgins couldn't breathe. The walls of the interrogation room seemed to be closing in on him. Section 1983. Qualified immunity. These were terms he had vaguely heard in training seminars, things he always assumed applied to other people. He had always believed the badge was a magical shield that protected him from the consequences of his own rage. Now, that shield was gone, and he was completely exposed. "She will take your house, Brad," Horowitz continued relentlessly. "She will take your cars, your savings, everything in your name. I strongly suggest you call your wife and tell her to start packing." Horowitz stood up, buttoning his jacket. He didn't offer to shake Higgins's hand. "I'll see you at the arraignment in the morning," the lawyer said, turning toward the door. "May God have mercy on you, Brad. Because Josephine Henderson certainly won't." The sun rose over the city, but it brought no warmth to Bradley Higgins. By 9:00 a.m. Monday morning, his life had become a catastrophic spectacle. The media frenzy was unlike anything the city had ever seen. The dashcam footage had been subpoenaed by local news stations and leaked online. Within hours, it had gone viral, amassing tens of millions of views. The image of the arrogant, aggressive cop slapping the calm, composed federal official became an instant symbol of systemic abuse. Higgins's face was plastered on every television screen, every news website, and every social media feed in the country. He was transported to the federal courthouse in an orange jumpsuit, his wrists and ankles bound in heavy chains. As the armored transport van pulled up to the loading dock, the flashing cameras of 100 paparazzi illuminated the dark tunnel. Higgins kept his head down, the shame burning so hot it physically hurt. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. The gallery was packed with reporters, civil rights advocates, and federal observers. Higgins sat at the defense table, looking incredibly small and frail. His wife, Diane, was noticeably absent from the gallery. Desperate to avoid his fate, Higgins had used his one phone call from holding to try and retain high-profile defense attorneys. He had begged his brother to call the offices of Mark Garagos and Thomas Messerow, men known for taking on impossible, high-stakes defense cases. But the rejection had been swift and humiliating. Both elite law firms politely but firmly declined to represent him the moment they learned the victim was the Deputy Attorney General of the Civil Rights Division. Nobody wanted to step onto the tracks in front of that particular freight train. Judge Eleanor Vance, a strict, no-nonsense federal judge with a reputation for merciless sentencing, took the bench. She looked down at Higgins as if he were a cockroach that had scuttled into her pristine courtroom. "Mr. Higgins," Judge Vance began, her voice dripping with contempt, "you stand before this court accused of violating 18 U.S.C. Section 242, false imprisonment, and felony assault under color of law. Your actions on the dashcam footage are not only abhorrent, they represent the absolute worst elements of law enforcement. You betrayed the public trust, and you assaulted a citizen who was simply trying to retrieve her mail." The prosecutor, a razor-sharp assistant U.S. attorney hand-picked by the DOJ, stood up. "Your Honor, the government requests that bail be denied. Given the severe public backlash and the defendant's loss of employment, he represents a flight risk. Furthermore, we have a sworn affidavit from his former partner, Officer Connor Reed, outlining a pattern of escalating, undocumented abuse." Higgins flinched as if he had been struck. Connor, the rookie he had bullied and threatened, had flipped on him instantly, securing absolute immunity in exchange for burying his former mentor. "Bail is denied." Judge Vance slammed her gavel down, the sound echoing like a death knell. "The defendant will be remanded to federal custody pending trial." As the federal marshals grabbed Higgins by the arms to drag him away, he caught a glimpse of a woman sitting in the front row of the gallery. It was Josephine Henderson. She was dressed impeccably in a sharp navy blue suit. The bruise on her cheek had faded slightly, but it was still visible, a testament to his arrogance. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't gloating. She simply watched him with the cold, detached interest of a scientist observing a specimen in a jar. As their eyes met, Higgins felt the full, crushing weight of karma settle over his shoulders. Over the next 4 weeks, the destruction of Bradley Higgins's life proceeded with surgical, terrifying precision. The civil lawsuit hit his mailbox 2 days after his arraignment. Faced with complete financial ruin and furious at the international humiliation, Diane filed for divorce within the week. She successfully petitioned the court to freeze his remaining half of their joint assets to protect herself from the impending judgments. Higgins's bank accounts were locked. His house in the suburbs was slated to be sold to cover the massive legal fees he was accruing with the second-rate defense attorney he had been forced to settle for. He lost his freedom. He lost his career. He lost his pension. He lost his wife, his home, and his reputation. In the span of a single month, Bradley Higgins had been reduced from an untouchable apex predator in a patrol car to a destitute, terrified inmate in a federal holding facility. The irony was not lost on anyone. Higgins had spent 2 decades believing that power came from intimidation, from a badge, and from a gun. He had believed that people like Josephine Henderson, people he deemed lesser, were helpless against his authority. But Josephine didn't need to yell. She didn't need to throw a punch. She possessed the ultimate power, the absolute mastery of the law, and the unrelenting, unforgiving force of a justice system she now commanded. She had taken his entire life apart, piece by piece, not with violence, but with paperwork, statutes, and cold, undeniable truth. And as Higgins sat alone in his tiny 6x8 concrete cell, staring at the grey walls, the only sound that echoed in his mind was the soft, chilling promise she had made in the dark back seat of his cruiser. You have just made the single biggest mistake of your entire life. 6 months later, the federal courthouse stood as a towering monument of marble and mahogany, a stark contrast to the sterile grey holding cell where Bradley Higgins had spent his winter. The highly anticipated sentencing hearing had drawn a massive crowd. News vans wrapped around the city block, their satellite dishes pointed toward the overcast sky. Inside courtroom 4B, the air was thick with tension, smelling faintly of lemon polish and the nervous sweat of a man whose life was about to officially end. Higgins sat at the defense table, barely recognizable as the aggressive, barrel-chested veteran cop who had patrolled Crestview Hills. He had lost 30 pounds. His uniform of authority had been replaced by a baggy, tan inmate jumpsuit that hung awkwardly on his thinning frame. His hair had grayed significantly, and his hands, locked in heavy iron cuffs resting on the wooden table, trembled violently. He had no family sitting behind him, no blue wall of silence to shield him. Captain Gallagher had been forced into early, disgraced retirement shortly after the DOJ took over the precinct, and Officer Connor Reed had long since transferred out of state, desperate to escape the toxic fallout. Higgins was entirely, utterly alone. Judge Harrison Caldwell, a man whose stern features looked as though they had been carved directly from granite, presided over the hearing. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the defense table with an expression of profound disgust. "Mr. Higgins!" Judge Caldwell's voice boomed through the microphone, echoing off the high, vaulted ceilings. "I have reviewed the presentence investigation report. I have watched the dashcam footage more times than I care to count. I have presided over this court for 22 years, exactly as long as you wore a badge. And in all my years on the bench, I have rarely seen a more blatant, arrogant and cowardly abuse of power." Higgins flinched, squeezing his eyes shut. Every word was a physical blow. "Before I hand down your sentence," Judge Caldwell continued, shifting his gaze to the gallery, "the court recognizes the victim, Deputy Attorney General Dr. Josephine Henderson, for a final impact statement." The courtroom went dead silent as Josephine stood up. She was dressed in a tailored, immaculate white suit, looking every bit the apex predator of the legal world. The physical bruise on her cheek had long since faded, but the sheer, uncompromising power radiating from her presence had only amplified. She walked past the defense table without so much as a downward glance at Higgins, stepping smoothly up to the podium. She adjusted the microphone. Her voice, calm and terrifyingly composed, filled the room. "Your Honor, when a citizen is assaulted by a police officer, the trauma is rarely just physical," Josephine began, her dark eyes scanning the room before finally settling on the broken man in the jumpsuit. "It is a profound violation of the social contract. Mr. Higgins operated under the delusion that his badge was a weapon of intimidation rather than a shield of public service. He looked at me in my driveway and saw a target. He saw someone he believed he could hurt with absolute impunity." She paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the air. Higgins kept his head bowed, tears silently tracking down his hollowed cheeks. But the true tragedy, and the ultimate irony of this situation, lies in the box he arrested me for holding, Josephine continued, her tone sharpening into a razor's edge. That box contained the final operational drafts for a federal consent decree, designed to root out civil rights violations within his specific precinct. Because of Mr. Higgins's actions that night, that decree was not quietly debated in committee rooms. It was fast-tracked by the United States Department of Justice. Because of his viral display of brutality, a sweeping federal audit was launched. 3 corrupt officers have already been indicted. His precinct has been completely restructured. Higgins let out a quiet, strangled sob. The karma was absolute. In his arrogant attempt to exert dominance over a black woman he deemed beneath him, he had single-handedly provided the federal government with the undeniable ammunition they needed to dismantle the very corrupt brotherhood he had worshipped. He hadn't just destroyed his own life, he had burned down his entire twisted world. "I am not a victim, Your Honor," Josephine said, her voice echoing with undeniable finality. "I am the consequence of his actions. I ask this court to impose the maximum sentence, not just as a punishment for Bradley Higgins, but as a promise to every single citizen who has ever been made to feel powerless on their own property. The law is not a weapon for the arrogant. The law is a reckoning." Josephine stepped away from the podium and walked back to her seat, her head held high. Judge Caldwell nodded slowly, his face grim. He looked down at Higgins. "Bradley Higgins, please stand." Higgins struggled to his feet, his knees shaking so violently that his defense attorney had to hold him by the elbow to keep him upright. "You betrayed the public. You betrayed your oath. And you assaulted a woman who represents the very pinnacle of the justice you were sworn to uphold," Judge Caldwell declared, his voice ringing like thunder. "It is the judgment of this court that you be committed to the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, to be imprisoned for a term of 120 months, the absolute maximum sentence of 10 years. This sentence is to be served without the possibility of early parole. Upon your eventual release, you will pay full restitution as dictated by the civil courts, which will garnish whatever future wages you manage to earn." The gavel slammed down with a deafening crack. Higgins collapsed back into his chair, a wailing, pathetic sound tearing from his throat. 10 years, a decade in a federal penitentiary where former cops were notoriously hunted. He had nothing waiting for him on the outside. His wife was gone. His house was sold. His bank accounts were drained by Josephine's ruthless, successful civil litigation. He was a ghost, chained to the floor of a courthouse, completely erased by the woman he had slapped in the dark. As the federal marshals yanked Higgins to his feet, dragging his dead weight toward the side door that led to the transport buses, he looked over his shoulder one last time. Josephine Henderson was walking down the center aisle of the courtroom, surrounded by a protective detail of suited agents. She pushed open the heavy oak doors, stepping out into the bright, blinding sunlight of a beautiful afternoon, leaving Bradley Higgins behind to rot in the absolute darkness he had built for himself. What a satisfying story of instant, brutal karma. If you loved watching arrogance get absolutely crushed by the unstoppable weight of the justice system, make sure to hit that like button right now. Stories like this prove that nobody is above the law, especially when they mess with the wrong person. Share this incredible true-to-life drama with your friends to remind them that karma never misses a deadline. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss out on more epic, jaw-dropping stories of revenge and justice. See you in the next video.